All right, welcome back to the Hogtown podcast, episode 47, with our returning guest and friend, Scott Aitchison, member of Parliament, housing critic. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, boys. Good to be back. I like it here.
Is housing critic the right term, or is it?
There's a bigger term, right?
Yeah,
there's a broader portfolio.
Initially, it was when right after Pierre won the leadership and named everybody, I think they wanted to match up critic roles with minister roles, and at the time, the minister was the Minister of Housing, Diversity, and Inclusion.
Right.
So they called me the critic for Housing, Diversity, and Inclusion. And now that's just I don't know. There's no formal letter saying I'm just the housing critic. Just the housing critic.
But that's your fault.
That's an interesting mishmash, actually.
Yeah.
Maybe some folks would have watched our first episode with you and might know who you are, but some might not. So maybe it's worth just giving a quick background on not only your role in federal politics, which we just covered, but also where you're coming from before this, because your background in municipal politics, I think, sort of frames a lot of your thinking on this issue. So.
Yeah. Of course, a long history in local government. I was an elected member of Huntsville Town Council and the Muskoka Regional Council for a long time. First elected when I was 21.
Mm-hmm. 5 years ago.
Just a couple years ago. The gray hair belies my age. Anyhow, I wound up ultimately being the mayor of Huntsville for about 5 years, and then in 2019 got elected to Parliament. So all through that time as a town councillor and a regional councillor, I was always on the Planning and Economic Development Committee, and I chaired it. So pretty active, and actually, I think more engaged than most municipal councillors are in the whole process of the development approvals process, the Planning Act, all that kind of stuff. I really sunk my teeth into it. I really enjoyed it, and that's I think kind of rare for locally elected officials. They kind of just like it's a bit complex, right?
Yeah.
I'm not telling you guys something you don't know, but most municipal councilors just kind of like rely on the professional planning staff. You just tell us what we should do here, or we'll just go with the neighbors and deny things. So I got pretty deeply involved in that. I really enjoyed it, and frankly, when I was mayor of Huntsville, housing was probably that and saving our hospital was the top issue of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really been a passion of mine for quite some time now. And I was pretty thrilled when Pierre asked me to take on the housing role federally.
And of course, you were a leadership candidate, and I think made the center point of your candidacy this issue of housing affordability, its impact on younger people, and so on.
Kicked off the whole campaign with a housing platform, which is I think a little unheard of.
Which Jamie Ellerton,
but it's unheard of, I think, for federal candidates, really, and really federal politicians to be talking as much about housing as we do. But the situation is what it is. But
right around the same time that Justin Trudeau was saying, this is not our responsibility as a federal government, right? This is around the time where you guys were running through your leadership race, and obviously a lot's changed since then. And now it's everybody's responsibility, seemingly. But
we have a new prime minister since then, and in fact, I think you last joined us on the podcast before the federal election, before Mark Carney became prime minister. Right. Maybe one place where we could start is just how do you think it's going? Even like let's talk about how Carney's doing, but even the change of tone would be interesting from your perspective, being in Parliament.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think if you just objectively look at what's gone on so far, Mark Carney's been prime minister now, 10 months, I guess.
Yeah.
Elected on a promise to, as the guy who could get a deal done with Donald Trump. And objectively, we do not have a deal with Donald Trump.
Yeah. We have a new deal with Xi Jinping.
Legitimately, that may not be an easy thing to do, but he was, the guy to do it. Apparently, that's what he said. And if we want to talk about housing specifically, I mean, he made a lot of big promises on housing during the election.
Some that we were frankly excited about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I honestly thought, this guy may get it. Like he may understand the challenges that we're facing on housing. He talked about things like getting development charges cut in half.
Yep.
And we've heard nothing about it since. Right. Nothing.
And we've had a budget since then. Yeah. Presumably that's where it would have shown up.
Yeah,
but nothing since.
You would think so. It might have shown up in there. Some of the announcements around this Build Canada Homes, the fourth federal housing bureaucracy we have now, but nothing in there either. But it was the rhetoric that really, I think, that actually kind of drove me crazy a little bit, because he talked about how his government was going to build at a scale not seen in generations.
Yeah.
When I did a speech in the House of Commons in response to their budget. And I focused on housing. And I said, my thought was, okay, you said you were going to build at a scale not seen in generations. Let's talk about the last generation where we had a massive housing crisis and we had to do something and do something fast. That was right after the war.
Yeah.
And I gave the whole rundown.
There's all these returning veterans.
Yeah. A million returning veterans and no place for them to live.
Right.
We weren't building houses for the last 5-6 years.
Yeah.
Coming out of the Depression and then the Second World War. And the government established the Central Mortgage and Housing Agency, now our Canadian Mortgage and Housing Agency, and they built cities, fast, in these beautiful houses that still exist today,
in what might have been described as the Greenbelt back then.
Maybe.
Well, Ajax specifically, I saw the history of Ajax. Ajax was basically built by CMHC.
Yeah,
it was a.
Well, I think of like massive parts of Etobicoke, where it's just like sort of post-war bungalows, right?
That's right.
Yeah. They basically built the suburbs effectively, and but I mean they solved the problem by getting governments out of the way, right? I mean, this is the other thing too. I sort of laid out the difference between how it was done back then and what the issues are today. Back then, when the CMHC set about building thousands and thousands and thousands of homes, they didn't have to go 8 rounds with the local city council to get approval. Yeah. There was no such thing as development charges after you've built all the infrastructure, then paying more money. Everything was simpler and faster. Yeah. And here's the really interesting thing. These post-war houses were so well built. You look around, you can see them everywhere. They're still lived in.
That's right.
Yeah.
They're great homes.
Yeah.
And in many cases, they're easy to add a second floor onto or a rear extension. Like you've seen them sort of Frankenstein and morph, but they're great foundational homes.
Yeah. And they aren't a blight on the city. They're so anyone that tells you that all the added layers of rules and bureaucracy have somehow made our system better just don't get it.
I think that's right. And what we've seen federally, because it's not just that you have these lower levels of government with their rules, and maybe the feds are kind of hesitant to override them. The feds themselves are introducing new rules that didn't apply to themselves, back in the post-war era. Yeah. You have all these, what we like to criticize this everything bagel liberalism. It's like, we want to double housing completions, but only if we could achieve energy efficiency, accessibility, affordability, local content, all these other requirements in parallel, which again kind of like acts to basically dilute that main objective. And my concern is that not only are we not going to double housing completions as Prime Minister Carney has promised, we're heading in the opposite direction. What we're seeing locally in Toronto is there will be much less housing built in 2-3 years than there is even today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Honestly, you could. You guys are builders. You're pretty innovative guys. I've seen some of the hoops you've had to jump through to get some really cool projects done. This is the thing, and the private sector is innovative. Like they can come up with solutions to the challenges that are before them, right? Yeah. And so even if you kept things like the various different regulations related to efficiency and all that kind of stuff, I don't have a problem with that stuff. I think that's good. Mm-hmm. The cost of building a home is one thing, but the cost of maintaining it's another. That's important too, right? Sure. So I get all that. The challenge that we have, of course, is that a lot of the changes being made to the national building code, which are then adopted by provincial codes, are completely unnecessary. And they're not driven by safety, really. They're not driven by cost. They're driven by the consultants that sit on these advisory boards that sell product.
That sell product, and generally they don't. My concern with them is they don't understand trade-offs. No. So it's kind of like we have this kind of ongoing discussion about elevator sizes in North America. You have many more small buildings with elevators in Europe because the elevators are allowed to be smaller than in Canada, where they have to be very big, and we get fewer of them. And it actually acts against the stated objective, because the stated objective for very large elevators, as example, is accessibility. But then we build more 4-story buildings with no elevators at all, which are less accessible. Right. So my concern with the National Building Code, which is ultimately harmonized with all the provincial codes, is there's no one in there doing the job of asking about what the trade-off is. How does this add cost to construction? And to your point, ultimately just adds to the cost of construction.
This is the thing, why don't you ask people that are on the front lines of this, doing this every day, for their input on it, right? Like, I remember my dad is an electrician. He's long retired now, but I remember as a little kid, not really even knowing what he was talking about, but he saw some updates to the electrical code years ago. And I remember him saying, he's like, sometimes I think they make changes just to justify the fact that they had a meeting.
That's right.
None of this makes any sense. It's not safer. It's just different. Yeah. I don't know why they're doing that. Yeah. I don't know why they don't have the electrician sitting in these in the electrical code review, right?
Yeah.
An electrician. What a good idea. No, it's salespeople.
And to your point, not just the parts vendor who's going to make, sell the part that is now required by government.
But on top of that, there's also the cost, right? Like back then, government didn't tax housing the way it taxes housing today, right?
Yeah.
And the federal level particularly. And we talk a lot about the GST, and the fact of the matter is, when that was introduced by Mulroney, they set
it was supposed to be a
limit,
rising
right?
threshold, right? Yeah.
Nothing under $450,000 would be charged the GST, and it was supposed to be indexed, and we know it never was.
Yeah.
And then the government literally got drunk on the revenue from home sales. And so we always talk about, I love how the Liberals say that housing is a human right, and then they tax it the same rate we tax cigarettes. And
that's right, like a sin tax. Well, it's funny, we tax housing heavily and then fund subsidy programs for housing, and maybe we could just skip both of those steps and just tax it less.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
On the National Building Code, before we move on, is that something that you're hearing of any action happening in Ottawa?
This is what drives me crazy. So I talk about it everywhere I go. Right. I got to get some traction on this. It's a very secretive process.
Yeah.
I've tried to dig in to find a little more about it, and it's not easy to find out.
Meaning there might be something happening, but it's very opaque.
Yeah. Well, right. Why do we not get to know exactly who's on those advisory boards?
Seems like a strange thing to be secretive about.
But the National Research Council does its thing. Yeah. I've asked ministers, like, the National Research Council, they kind of do their own thing. I'm like, pardon me?
Yeah.
Do they not report to you?
Yeah. That's right.
Are they not accountable to the Canadians? Yeah. Apparently not. But I'm just going to keep pushing until I get. And
the National Building Code, because there's often this response that you get from federal ministers and bureaucrats that they could only do so much at that level of government. But the National Building Code is squarely federal jurisdiction. It's not the building code that's in effect in Ontario, but the Ontario code regularly harmonizes with the federal code. So whatever you set in the National Building Code does have this
signal
nationwide,
at minimum and more.
Totally. And it provides political cover. If you're doing something that might be, difficult with fire chiefs in Ontario, it's much easier to say we're just harmonizing with the national code than we're doing it here.
But here's the bigger concern about all this.
Yeah.
They're talking about harmonizing all building codes across Canada, right?
Yeah.
And they're on kind of a one national code. But they're not asking the right question. If you're going to harmonize the code, that might create some efficiencies. But how are we creating that code?
That's right.
Is that the right code for Canada?
Yeah.
Right.
I would argue it's not.
Yeah.
There's way too many things in there that have made housing way too expensive for no real reason other than somebody lobbied really.
Yeah, totally. The inefficiency of harmonizing is if it's the most burdensome, expensive code.
Yeah.
We're actually going in the wrong direction.
Then you want provinces to have flexibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's go back for a second to what was in the platform of the Mark Carney government before they got elected on housing. You mentioned development charges being cut in half. There was the MERB, multi-unit rental building, tax incentive that was part of that platform.
Yep.
And then there was Build Canada Homes. On those three pillars, the way we sort of looked at it, if they've really only followed through on one, and from our perspective, the least favorable of the three was starting a federal agency to build housing. So, but the other two, are you hearing anything on MERB? Are you hearing anything on development charge relief?
Nothing on either one of those.
And these were like central planks.
But this is kind of the point, right? Like, this is why I thought, maybe Mark Carney gets it.
Right.
He understands if he was going to deal with development charges and he was going to deal with the MERB program, then he understood that at its core, the housing crisis in Canada is a cost crisis.
Yeah.
Governments charge too much money to get homes built.
Yeah.
He understood that. I thought, okay, he gets it, and it's the two most important issues related to that he's done nothing about.
And presumably, when these things make it to a platform, they're costed to some extent. So it can't come as a surprise that we actually can't afford that, so we're not going to do it. I wonder, what is your theory as to why we haven't seen action on those other two items?
Well, my strong suspicion when it comes to development charges is that he woke up in the Prime Minister's residence and went, oh, geez, that's not going to be easy to do.
Yeah.
How do you get Toronto to cut their development charges in half, let's say?
Yeah.
I'd always assumed it would just be backfilled with
without
federal
buying them off, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And then how do you justify that in Saskatoon,
right,
where they're getting things done?
Yeah.
And they need infrastructure dollars, but they approve things and they get homes built.
Because you'd actually be rewarding
you're going to reward the worst gatekeepers, right?
Yeah. Totally.
And so I think he probably woke up and go, well, not only it's going to be expensive, and how do you do it?
Yeah.
They've kind of done it a little bit already, right? You look at the Downsview Park project, right, where part of the federal contribution to that. Like, that's the other thing too. It drives me crazy that we keep talking about how look at Build Canada Homes. They're getting going on these 6 sites of federal land, and they're going to build a few thousand homes for some exorbitant sum of money. But Canada Lands Company, one of the other federal housing agencies, has been working on those sites for years, right? So it's not like they've sped anything up.
It's sort of like the major project office announcing projects that were already in the pipeline, right?
Yeah, we're going to announce this again because we've been working on it for a decade. Anyhow, it's whatever. More optics, right?
Yeah.
But then they, as part of that deal, they give the city of Toronto another $200 and something million for a wastewater system that the city's already charged development charges for.
Yeah.
They've already soaked new residents for that to the tune of millions of dollars, and they give them more money. It's called rewarding the worst of the worst.
Well, on that note of the feds giving Toronto money, the feds also entered into this Housing Accelerator Fund agreement with Toronto for $471 million. This was under Trudeau and at the time Sean Fraser.
Yeah.
Toronto, in many ways, did not live up to its side of the agreement, including it had this requirement to upzone the whole city to allow for 6-unit multiplexes that only passed in 9 out of 25 wards. And as far as we could tell, like maybe there's still more to come, but there's been no consequence municipally. Like with it, like this breach of agreement has not led to the feds withholding any money or threatening to withhold any money. So. Yeah, it seems like these agreements only work if there's like the threat of you can't breach.
You guys have kids. If there's no consequences, do they learn anything when they do? Right?
That's right.
There's got to be a consequence.
Yeah,
I still remember my brother and sister-in-law are always like, "There's going to be a consequence." There's no consequences, right?
And I think the signal now is pretty like
it's a vote buying exercise, right? Like, can you think of a more clear example of just buying votes and in seats like Toronto, where the Liberals have seats?
Right.
You look at that as an example. I mean, I even asked Sean Fraser in committee about that specifically. I said, and it was about development charges at the time. I said, you agreed to give the city of Toronto $471 million for 6 key areas, lots more detail. But I said, as soon as the ink was dry, they increased their development charges by 40%.
That's right. Yeah.
You don't think that actually limits the number of houses that are going to get built because they're increasing the cost?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, we have another fund that we're going to use to try to encourage development charges to come down. I'm like, another fund?
Yeah.
Like, you just want to keep giving them money and hope that they do better.
I don't want to put you on the spot on a provincial question, but that was very much enabled by our friends at Queen's Park as well, right? To allow for the unfreezing of development charge increases last
There was
year.
this bill 23 and they reversed it.
Yeah. But so there's a lot of like overlapping.
One thing the federal government can do, I don't know if you've kind of gone down this rabbit hole. We had our friend Ben Dacus, who you may or may not know. Ben's great.
Yeah.
And one of his suggestions, something that the federal government can do to encourage reduction in municipal development charges. A lot of our infrastructure municipally is built with very little debt, actually, relative global cities. And one of the reasons why we don't use more debt is because we can't issue municipal bonds, or at least we don't issue municipal bonds. And even if we did, municipal bonds are taxed federally. Mm-hmm. And I think the U.S. has a federal tax exemption on municipal bonds, so that municipalities could raise more debt and basically have to charge less in taxes and development charges to fund infrastructure.
Yeah. I think it's a great idea. And I think that there's all kinds of tools that municipalities could and should be using. And this is the other thing too, like you say, I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Like there are other jurisdictions all over the world that do this
that don't have our level of development charges.
Even in Canada, there are cities that do this better. Like the province of Alberta has a much better way of financing these things than we do.
Yeah.
We just can't forget that BC and Ontario, particularly, have decided that growth shall pay for growth.
Yeah.
And that's fundamentally not sustainable.
Yeah.
We know that now. I don't know why I think the province actually does understand it.
Yeah.
I also acknowledge too that one of the challenges that provinces have is that constitutionally they're responsible for municipalities, including any debts that they have, right? And so I think there's some reticence to letting municipalities borrow too much money.
Yeah.
But that's good debt, right? Like debt that is
infrastructure
that is actually assigned to building infrastructure, an actual asset.
Yeah.
That's good debt, right? Yeah. I mean, there's not. So I don't know why we wouldn't use that tool.
Yeah.
To the provincial government's credit, they did start moving in the direction towards these municipal utility corporations in the most recent housing bill.
Another Ben Dacus idea, which I think
is a big step towards the possibility of actual debt financing on infrastructure. So we may see movement on that in the next couple of years.
Well, because this idea of growth paying for growth, which is kind of like the rhetoric you hear for development charges, a lot of it is fake, because when you think about what development charges fund, until very recently, as an example, development charges funded shelters and affordable housing. And it's not obvious to me why the growth in building new housing contributes to the growth in the need for shelters and affordable housing. Maybe just the opposite.
Well, this is the thing about this development charge thing. I've been in rooms as a municipal councillor, as a mayor, with the staff from one of the two consulting firms that do the background studies for municipalities, right?
Yeah.
And I have watched these guys coach municipal staff on how they can add things to the development charge background study,
justify the highest rates.
Surely 5% of that new fire hall is related to growth, isn't it?
That's right.
I'm like, no, it's
just
not.
games.
It's just games, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing too. I mean, I think that the development charge tool is not a bad tool. I mean, in moderate use, it does make some sense. Yeah. But there needs to be some dramatic reduction.
Well, I think one of the challenges
you can use it for.
No, I think that's right. If you're building a new building and you need more sanitary capacity, it makes sense to kind of link these things. I think that makes total sense. I also think it makes sense politically to have people in the existing houses in the community know that new development benefits them through some contribution. Absolutely. But it's all about like where you set the level.
Yeah. Well, I was going to add, like, I think one of the political challenges that seems very real in this issue is the dynamic between older homeowners and younger would-be homeowners. I mean, Mike Moffat on his podcast, The Missing Middle, he references growth paying for growth as really just being younger homeowners subsidizing older homeowners.
Yep.
And it's this inability to tackle, at least in Ontario, the issue of property taxes and how land assessments are done. Like we have this very, very outdated land assessment system where we haven't reassessed values of land since like 2016 or something like that. It's politically unpopular to talk about property taxes. And I think there's a whole bunch of stuff under that, like are our municipalities wasting money in their day-to-day operations?
Yeah.
But effectively, in order to not increase property taxes, we then say, hey, new homeowners who typically are younger are going to pay this disproportionate bill in development charges so that these retired people can keep their low property taxes.
That's basically it, right?
It's a very tough dynamic. I can see why politicians are sort of scared of tackling that head on.
It is a generational divide for sure.
Yeah.
But this is I think that, when you look at the development approvals process, we talked about, what happened right after the war and how CMHC was created, and they built homes literally all over the place, and it was amazing how fast they got it done. But if you look at even the last 30 years of the evolution of our development approvals process, our planning tools, official plans and zoning bylaws, they have become dramatically more complex. Yeah. And and no one individual or one individual group is responsible for it. But the last couple of generations, through their NIMBYism, frankly, have helped to make these documents more complex, requiring a public meeting for almost anything you want to do. Yeah. And so without any understanding of what makes good planning, what is great city building, people that just don't like change just stand up and say, I don't like it. Yeah. And guess who votes in the municipal elections? The people that are already there, right? Yeah. So the people that don't have a home yet, they don't get a vote. Yeah. Right. And so, and I don't think that happens maliciously. People just like, well, I
self-interested.
I just don't want any change. And they think that they come up with reasons why they don't like the change. They try to justify it with like, oh, it's going to decrease my property value. Oh, my privacy. Oh, this, whatever. Right. And, none of it really makes any sense unless you understand that they just don't like change. Yeah, and it's funny. There's some studies that looked into this, and if you actually drill down into who complains about change, it's often like a very tiny percentage of the population, but they have a disproportionate voice because of all these consultations. Like one example that was brought up in this study is like if you look into noise complaints near airports, it's like 80% of noise complaints is like one house, and they just take the total volume as like the community doesn't like the noise, and it's the same thing. And inevitably the person that is complaining moved in there long after the airport was operating, right? Yeah. It's not like all of a sudden an airport got built right after they moved in. Yeah. Like that was there for years. Right. And all of a sudden we go to enough community consultation meetings that we see a lot of the repeat characters. And my sense is that, these are often framed, community consultation is often framed as a democratic tool, but in many ways it's anti-democratic because it's elevating the voice of a very small number of often just kind of like antisocial people at the cost of everyone who might move into this new building or whatever. Yeah. And I don't know what it would take to do a reset on this idea of consultation. It seems pretty embedded in the kind of Anglosphere political system. Yeah. But what do you think about that? What I think is what we need to do is more planning so we can do less processing. Right. So whether that's that's giving official plans a little more depth in terms of identifying areas of the city, for example, where you think there should be high density infrastructure, right? There are the obvious examples. We're looking at one of your projects over here, for example, by the GO station.
Yeah,
that's a very clear example of where you need high density
near transit,
right near that infrastructure,
totally.
right? And so if your official plan speaks to the importance of high density within a certain radius of regional rail like that, for example, then if it's in that radius and it meets the specifications for what's high density in your official plan, then there is no public meeting.
Yeah, that's right. More as of right permissions.
There's public meetings on the official plan, right? That's a very public process, and it should be a very public process, and it should engage the community, and people should understand that.
Yeah,
but you shouldn't have
on a property by property basis.
Stop that.
Yeah,
to me, there's sort of a pretty notable cultural impact where you actually just create hostility within neighborhoods. Where if that mechanism didn't exist, you wouldn't be pitting neighbor against neighbor because they wouldn't have this official channel to go air their frustrations.
You know what I used to describe when I was chairing a planning committee, and then when it became mayor, I used to tell people that would come to committee and council complaining about things. I said, this system is really designed for neighbors to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And so people come and say, oh, I need your support on something. Well, go talk to your neighbors first. Engage them a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't always work. Because you know what, people don't like change. This is part of the problem. So I don't suggest for a second that planning is a bad thing. I think we just don't do enough of it.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we're constantly going through these public meetings that, like you say, cause anxiety, cause extra delays, which may add costs and just make it too expensive. And so, in many ways, I look at the process through which we approve the construction of homes and how it has evolved, how it has thickened and gotten slower and more expensive. And it really is the prime example of kind of what's happened to our country.
Yeah.
Everything takes longer, the processes. And part of the reason for that is fundamentally because politicians aren't leaders. They hide behind process.
Yeah.
They try to get out of a difficult situation by calling for yet another study.
Yeah.
In what world?
Consultation.
In what world does it make sense for an engineer to prepare something, an engineered, whether it's a stormwater management pond or whatever it might be, and where they accept that their work should be peer reviewed by another engineer?
Right.
And the ring must mean something.
Right.
But apparently not, because we peer review this stuff all the time.
Right.
And of course, the consultants love it because it's just more billable hours for them.
That's right. Yeah.
That's okay. We'll peer review your project next time.
Yeah.
And they just and so this is what politicians do now.
Yeah.
Instead of making decisions, instead of leading, we hide behind.
Well, I don't know if you saw this week the new head of the Alto high-speed rail train. There was an article where he said, "Hey, we're really proud to announce we're going to be in construction in 2032," which was just and like Twitter blew up on this because it's so emblematic of like an announcement for a possible construction start in 6 years, which really means 10 years or never. And like that's a prime example, right? If we can't build housing, we're definitely not going to build high-speed rail infrastructure. We're not going to build pipelines. We're not going to build all the things the country desperately needs right now. And it is sort of this like root cultural issue, I think, in our politics.
It is. We as a nation have just been drifting into this.
Well, the problem is that like whether again, back to Mike Moffat and his podcast. I was listening to his last episode, and they were talking about the Greenbelt specifically. We don't need to go into it in a lot of depth because it is mostly provincial, but they're sort of like outlining the potential solutions to the Greenbelt. Do you get rid of the Greenbelt? Do you reform the Greenbelt? Do you leave the Greenbelt as it is and upzone cities, or do you just do nothing? And I think the real answer is that the likely outcome is we'll just do nothing because it's politically easier to do nothing. But doing nothing is a political decision with consequences, right? It's as much of a decision as doing something, right? Yeah. So, and I don't think that we ever weigh the outcomes of doing nothing, which has been our status quo for a long time.
And that's just it, right? I mean, like you got to use some of your political capital, right? Make decisions. I always describe it this way when I talk to people about my own experience. When I was chair of planning, when I was a mayor, I was easily the most pro-development mayor in the history of Huntsville. I believed in getting things done. I challenged the development staff, the planning staff, that if somebody came into the municipal office and they wanted to invest money to build something, but it didn't quite, fit within what we were trying to do with our OP, and they just said no. I told them, I said, well, I don't need you.
Yeah.
I can hire anybody to say no.
Yeah.
You're the professional. Your job is to help us get to yes.
Find a solution.
Because I want them to invest that money in our community. That's important.
Yeah.
And so you're the professional. That means your job is to help us get to yes. Planning departments don't operate that way.
Yeah.
They don't see themselves as customer service. They see themselves as protecting the city from the big bad developer.
Now, were you enabled as the mayor of Huntsville to actually reform that, to change the mandate of the planning staff, or is that sort of beyond municipal?
It was
authority?
a cultural change.
Right,
it was a cultural change, and I absolutely had 1,000% support of council. They completely were, on board. We declared Huntsville was open for business, and then we set about to actually open it up for business, right? And it's not like we didn't do any planning, and it's not like we just let people build whatever they wanted, right? We had rules. In fact, in some cases, I insisted we add some rules to some of the waterfront development. As an example, we made it a little more restrictive to make sure that we could protect the trophic zone of the lake and all that kind of stuff. But we were open for business, and we didn't change the rules in the process either, right? We got things done. It was very, very business friendly, but you had to follow the rules too.
Yeah.
But we found ways to get it done, and this to me is fundamentally the problem. I don't think a lot of municipal councillors really truly understand the planning process, and so they just like, I just don't.
Certainly
know.
true.
I really don't get it, right? So you tell you what you want me to think. And by the way, those people voted for me last election.
Yeah.
I want them to vote for me again. So but I would tell residents that come in and say, I don't like this. I say, come sit down and talk to me. Tell me why you don't like it. And we go through their list of reasons why they didn't like it. And inevitably I would answer, okay, well, it's going to be more traffic. It's too much traffic. I'm like, well, we live in Huntsville.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as traffic, really. Let's be honest. But we're going to add like 8 cars to this street. And so I do the math where I'm saying, okay, so you're going to see a couple more cars a day. Is that really? Well, no, I guess not. Well, I like the view. I'm like, well, you don't own the view, right? If you wanted to protect that view, you should buy that land.
That's right.
If you wanted to build a deck, but somebody says, I like to see the grass, is that your fault? Or, people have rights. So, anyhow, I would go through their complaints with them one by one. Do you want a fence for privacy? Oh, that would be nice. Okay, well, why don't we have that conversation instead of just saying no?
Talk to your neighbor and they'll happily build it for you.
Right.
That's...
And so we would have these discussions, and oftentimes people would be like, I'm still not happy about it, but I appreciate being listened to. Thank you. I got reelected as mayor of Huntsville with 85% of the vote.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right? I mean, and it wasn't because I pandered to people, because I told them the truth.
Yeah.
And led. And made decisions.
That's encouraging. Now, of course, the Conservative Party did not win the federal election, so you're in opposition. So how do you see that role? Because obviously, if you were a housing minister, there's a lot you could do. You'd be in power. What is the role of a housing critic? Like, obviously, you're trying to hold the federal government to account, to pass good policy, and to question them when they don't. Is there more to it than that? Are we already thinking about what comes next, or what does day to day, week to week look like?
Maybe I'll add to that. Can you practically work with the minister on actual issues? Like, are they open to collaborating, saying, hey, I have a recommendation, I have a policy? Because some of the stuff is not always partisan. I think housing is one of the areas where there actually is common ground in some instances, right?
There is. I mean, I certainly know some of the staff level. Like Paul Hodge is the deputy minister. He's like the top staff person in the housing and infrastructure ministry. Paul is a very, very, very smart man, and he gets a lot of this stuff. I've had lots of great conversations with him. Gregor Robertson and I are friendly enough, but I'll be honest, I don't think he really gets the scope of the problem. I don't think he realizes how bad it is.
Right.
We keep talking. Well, as an example, I don't know if you ever saw. I'm sure you listened to David Hurley and the Hurley Burley podcast, but Gregor Robertson was on there after I was, and Hurley asked him directly. He says, there are people like Mike Moffat and Aitchison, the conservatives are saying you need to cut the GST on all homes under $1.3 million, not just for first time home buyers.
Yeah.
And he says, what's the argument? He asked him, what's the argument for not doing that?
Yeah.
And his response was this gobbledy mesh of like, oh, that's a pretty big, scary move. It's pretty risky. And so we're going to try these things and see how they work and go from there. I'm like, dude.
Yeah.
The time for tinkering around the edges of this issue, that's long gone.
Yeah.
That's long gone.
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental difference. Back after the war, they made big, bold, beautiful moves.
Which was again,
and now today, in a situation that is demonstrably worse than it was back then, they think big, bold moves are too risky.
Yeah.
They don't get it.
I mean, generously, I've been keeping to the line that he's a bad communicator, but increasingly it's hard to get past the fact that I just don't think he understands.
Yeah,
he's supposed
well, I
to
think it's
solve.
worse than that.
Yeah.
And you are a former mayor who is pro-development, but generally mayors, I think, hesitate to be pro-development because like all of their political training to date has been like getting yelled at, if they're pro-development. Why do you think he was appointed? Because that was a very interesting choice. Carney made this a central part of his platform to do something on housing. And I don't know, by all outside kind of observers, did not appoint like a very pro-housing guy as housing minister. Like, what's that choice?
I honestly don't know why he
just
appointed
have
him.
so many people to choose
For
from?
people who don't know, Gregor Robertson,
he was a mayor.
10 years as mayor of Vancouver.
Maybe he thought having a mayor in that position was a smart move optically. I don't know, but this is the other problem with Gregor Robertson and his politics is that when you ask him, challenge him for why municipalities, Vancouver is a great example, why the local charges, city charges on housing have gone up so dramatically. I think they went up about 140% when he was mayor of Vancouver.
Yeah,
and his response is along the lines of, well, these developers were making so much money, the city had to get their piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then we have a fundamentally different understanding of what government is for.
Yeah. And what do we try to accomplish?
Well, I actually think,
do we want more housing or do we want more of a piece?
Yeah.
Going back to the question of why they didn't follow through on MERB and DC reductions, but they did follow through on Build Canada Homes. It feels like, as minister, Build Canada Homes is the one thing that aligns very well with his philosophy on housing. The government should be
Government should do it. Government should do it.
Everything else is sort of like enabling the private sector. And so I think there's just a philosophical disagreement. And if the minister's asked, hey, of these three priorities, which one do you think is the most important? And the minister's response is the government should be building housing, then all of a sudden that becomes priority number one and everything else gets put on the back burner.
Look at the cost related to what they have announced so far. It's staggeringly expensive per unit.
Yeah.
I think I don't know exactly.
Well, and I'm skeptical that it'll even get
doing.
done at those prices. I mean, we've heard anecdotally, and this is outside of the federal realm, but the city of Toronto's got these projects through Create TO, Build TO that they're pursuing, and some of these are 2 to 3 times more expensive on a per square foot construction cost basis than what the market's building.
This is why you don't want government building things for you. They're actually not good at it.
Yeah.
I always tell people this, like bureaucracy is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
But you got to use it for what it's meant for.
Yeah.
A bureaucracy is designed to do tomorrow what it did yesterday without causing any problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's like, okay, issue that passport. Do the exact same thing you did yesterday. It's a routine thing. But you don't get innovation and like creative outside the box thinking out of a bureaucracy, generally speaking, right? So you can't like try to get that out of it. That's not what you should be trying to do. And building homes is it's not easy. It's a complex process.
Yeah.
And so why wouldn't you have the experts who are really good at it do it? Yeah. And if you need to help make the math work on units that are affordable or deeply affordable, even social and supportive housing, right? Then you help make that math work.
Totally.
Help make that math work. Yeah. But then have the private sector build it, because you know what? They will build it better and faster than some bureaucracy.
Well, for what it's worth, I think the federal government right now, if they wanted to pump a whole bunch of below market rate housing into the market, they could just go buy some unsold condos off the market, because there's thousands of them sitting there unsold
for a fraction of what it's going to cost to build.
For a fraction, with no risk, because they're built, right? And then you just say, hey, we just bought 1,000 new units in Toronto. We're making them affordable tomorrow.
But it's such a great point, actually. That would solve some problems maybe right here in Toronto. But at its core, this is the most small C conservative solution I've ever heard in my life. It's actually less government.
Yeah.
If the government just reduced its burden and cost, that would have a dramatic impact. Dramatic impact already, right?
And we have global
if there was less government, you would solve the problem.
You could look to Austin, which is not too far off. Yeah. It's so cheap to build there, and it's so unregulated to build there, that rents are lower today than they have been in the last 6 years. And interestingly, I don't even fully kind of wrap my head around this. People are still building. Builders are still building despite rents being lower every year than they were the year prior. So to your point of like, we could just look to global comparisons. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Markets, even in the U.S., which is North American, very similar context, that have less tax, less regulation, build more housing, and housing is more affordable.
Yeah. And Austin, Texas is like a very democratic city and a sea of Republicanism. Right?
And
they get it.
They totally get it. And I think like, again, there is this attitude that we see at all levels of government, but certainly in the federal government, where it's like, to address the shortcomings or unintended consequence of one intervention, we need another intervention, and then the more you stack them, the more unpredictable it all becomes.
Yeah,
and I think you're exactly right. We just need
and
to
that's fundamentally the difference, I think, between liberalism generally and conservatism is that liberals generally think there's no problem a big government bureaucracy can't fix.
Well, my sense of this government is that, summed up right now, it just seems like any part of the economy that seems to be malfunctioning, they want to insert themselves in the middle of that part of the economy, whether it's major project infrastructure or whether it's housing. They're saying, oh, we need to play a much larger role, not only in regulation, but also in actually like directing economic activity. I mean, you look at Build Canada Homes, the mandate is still relatively ambiguous as far as we can tell. But it really is just them deciding what's going to get built by who, with how much money, and they're now the arbiter of what.
And not just that, with what methods of construction and what materials,
what designs, all these things.
It's very
Well, that's the other
prescribed.
Thing but again, this is why this government drives me crazy, because it's always about optics, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You know that catalog they came out with, for pre-approved designs with the CMHC. I said to the minister, I said honestly, Sean, designing the house is the easiest part of the process.
Yep.
Thanks for your help on that.
Yeah.
Now get the cost down, can you? No.
Yeah.
Oh no, we're going to focus on this.
And I think part of the problem with the catalog specifically is they try to use this analogy of the post-war CMHC, where they had these catalogs where in greenfield land you could just do the same house over and over again on lots that you define yourself. It's very different to do that in infill housing. When we buy a lot in Toronto, we want custom design because we want to make the most out of that specific lot in that specific neighborhood.
Yeah.
So I think it was just kind of a misdiagnosis of the issue, and like why this post-war comparison to infill housing doesn't work.
There's also a huge disconnect too, and I know we've talked a bit about this in the past, is that some of the things that they have put in place, these tax incentives to try to get multiple units built on existing single-family residential. There are examples where the intent of the housing policy people doesn't quite meet with the desires of the CRA and the tax collectors, right?
Yeah.
And so they don't care what the intent was. They don't care what the objective is.
Yeah.
The tax collector, their job is to collect as much tax as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And so they will always try to find a way to get around whatever intent of whatever policy there is. And so this creates such a level of uncertainty, and that uncertainty, of course, scares capital away and investment away faster than anything else. And this is, again, it's the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. And it just makes it that much more expensive and harder to get stuff built.
To give a very specific example on that point, the federal government waived GST on purpose-built rental construction. The province matched it by waiving HST altogether. So HST is now rebated on rental development. But the way the CRA is interpreting it is that if you keep even one foundation wall, let's say you need it to maintain shoring to not undermine the foundation of your neighbor. If you keep one foundation wall, it now counts as a renovation and it is no longer exempt from HST. And this is what, it's not just like to your point that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, but the left hand doesn't care to follow through and keep an eye on things and make sure that it's being done correctly.
Yeah.
And this is a major problem with this rebate where people are getting stuck with bills that the federal government told them they should not have to pay because of this kind of like, and this is like pernicious. It's like it exists in every like one of these programs.
And in this regard, the Mark Carney government feels very much just like the Justin Trudeau government.
Yeah.
It's all flash, all announcements.
Yeah,
it's a great photo op.
Yeah.
It's good talking points. You remember the life-changing, like generational national housing strategy?
Yeah.
How'd that work out? Right?
Yeah.
There was never been any follow through.
Yeah. They
think once they made the announcement, and once they tell you,
magic happens.
Look how much money we spent. Yeah, but there's no results.
Yeah.
Oh, but we spent this much money. That's there's no follow through, and to me, in that regard, they're turning out to be very much the same as Justin Trudeau.
Which is very disappointing.
I want to get your take on something that, maybe we have a bias for, but I think this is objectively true. When you look at the national housing crisis, there's ways to point to examples in pretty much every submarket in Canada, whether you're looking at Halifax or Edmonton or Barrie, Ontario, or whatever it might be. But it seems like a lot of it at its root is that our major cities got too expensive and we started exporting people to everywhere else in the country, right? So if you couldn't afford to live in Toronto, you moved to Milton. If you couldn't afford to live in Milton, you moved to London, or you flew to Halifax or whatever the case might be. And so we've always described this as like Toronto in particular, but maybe Vancouver and maybe Montreal to a certain extent, Calgary, have exported their housing problem to the rest of the country. And when I look at the federal government's tools to address housing, things like CMHC's programs like MLI Select to build rental housing, they're actually designed in a way where it makes it less viable to build housing in the markets that are most in need. I think of Toronto specifically, but they make it really easy to build housing in the markets that they're least in need. So we're seeing a massive boom in rental housing in places like Barrie, Ontario, and Edmonton, but we're seeing very little get built in places like Toronto and Vancouver. Maybe you could talk broadly about this, because I know, nationally, the government would have this issue of having to be seen as regionally fair, sort of like distributing the economic impact everywhere. But I think if you sort of don't tackle this head on, you continue to export the problem indefinitely, where Halifax is more expensive today than it was 5 years ago because Toronto never got its act together. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, no, it's actually an incredibly important point. I hadn't really thought about much, but it's true. I mean, you look at what happens in Toronto. People oftentimes ask me, what are you talking about the city of Toronto for? You're like the member of parliament for cottage country. Shut up, leave it alone. But what happens in Toronto dramatically affects what happens in my community.
Yeah, Huntsville, yeah,
right? Huntsville,
yeah.
Prices went up dramatically because people were getting out of Toronto, cashing in on a house that they sold for millions more than they ever dreamt they would get for it.
Yeah.
And then they come up, buy a new place, brand new, cash, which drives up the prices in our area. Housing's been a crisis in Huntsville long before I became the member of parliament, and it's gotten worse because of what's happening in Toronto.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right that unless we address the issue where effectively the epicenter of the crisis is the GTA and the Lower Mainland.
Yeah.
And unless we address the issue there, we're never going to catch up to it everywhere else.
Yeah.
Well, I think what that means in my mind is that the policy tools need to look unfair to the rest of the country. Because if you're not like directly targeting,
no, but I think it's unfair in a good way, because to the extent that you have this political problem of existing residents don't want change, but you need change for there to be enough housing for new generations, it's kind of like, don't benefit Toronto. Pick on Toronto. We're going to upzone Toronto so that you in Huntsville don't have to have a new shadow in your backyard. Like I always say, like a Huntsville NIMBY should be a Toronto YIMBY. And I think Pierre kind of astutely identified this dynamic by limiting some of the federal proposed action to these, I think it was 10 big cities.
Yeah.
And it's a way to kind of like not rankle the NIMBYs in the other parts of the country, but also, to Matt's point, to actually direct the action where it's most needed. So like to me, it's not only like true in terms of the policy need, but it's also political opportunity where you actually don't need to like worry about Calgary NIMBYs because we can just upzone Vancouver and Toronto or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the other thing too. In a lot of those other cities, like Edmonton, like Saskatoon, like Calgary, it is easier to get things built. I mean,
much easier.
It's just the process is actually faster. It is actually cheaper.
Yeah.
And frankly,
Edmonton actually in particular seems to have gotten a lot of things right.
They get it. They get it right. Right.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you. It's not favoring Toronto. It's actually picking on Toronto.
Yeah.
Whipping them into shape, making them clean up their act.
Pick on us, We have a federal party convention coming up later this month.
Indeed.
I know like one of the big topics of discussion, the big items will be Pierre's, what was it, the review or the leadership review. Are you expecting much in terms of new policy discussion? I mean, I think we had a pretty strong platform last time, but what are you expecting? What are you hoping to see? What are you pushing for yourself?
Yeah, there's always a good policy discussion. The plenary discussions they're all always interesting, and of course there's controversial topics that come up, and the membership debates it and votes on it. It's, so that's every convention, which is a good thing
for every party.
Absolutely, it's important to do. That's democracy in action. May not be the prettiest thing you've ever seen, but it's democracy in action.
Yeah.
So that'll go on, and that's great. What I like about conventions, they're like reunions. You get to see people all over the country you haven't seen in a while. So I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to catching up with people out there. Of course, there is the leadership review as well. And I'm not really in the business of predictions, but I predict that Pierre will receive an overwhelming endorsement of the membership.
Yeah.
The guy.
Are you crossing over to the Liberals?
Absolutely not.
The big question.
I'm starting to feel offended. They haven't even tempted.
Oh,
They haven't even asked me.
No
They're
money.
asking everybody but
And
me.
No ambassadorship.
I couldn't join them. I'm not sure I could whip those guys into shape anyhow. So no, I'm not joining them.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, I think I predict the same thing. A strong new mandate for the leader for Pierre Poilievre, and then I guess the big question is when do we get back to the polls? And I think that's much more of an open question, including or maybe especially because we have all these or a few of these floor crossings.
Yeah, I mean, so far, you look at how it's gone so far for Mark Carney, and so far it feels like very much the honeymoon is. We're still in the honeymoon phase for Mark Carney.
Yeah.
He's really not accomplished anything.
Yeah,
He's done a lot of travel, and there's some good photo ops, right?
Yeah.
But most people are still giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's still pretty expensive to put food on the table.
Yeah.
And that's getting worse.
Yeah.
And now there are, in your industry, for example, we're talking real job losses now.
Oh yeah. Major.
Right? Things are getting worse, and I think they're going to get worse.
Totally agree.
The next 5 years looks pretty
because
bleak.
you know, I don't think they're doing the things that they need to do to get things like housing moving. And so I suspect pretty strongly that you know, when the honeymoon is over and Canadians start to say, well, wait a second, you were the guy to get the deal. Where's the deal?
Yeah.
My suspicion, though, is that he's going to want to try to go for a majority, and he'll want Donald Trump as his foil. So he'll want to make sure he has an election before Donald Trump has left office.
I think that's right. I think the honeymoon is extended to the extent that Trump kind of picks on us.
Yeah.
Because
his best issue is Trump. So if he waits for Trump to not be in office anymore, he loses his
until, like to your point, until it be like you would think at some point it becomes a liability if you're not dealing with that issue, you know, as you promised you would.
You would think so.
You would think so.
Yeah. It may yet come. I don't know. Anyhow,
Yeah.
I agree with you. Honestly, it's don't get me wrong. I actually like Mark Carney. He's a very nice fellow. I think he's a very smart guy. He's very approachable. I've talked to him about a couple different items. Easier to chat with than Gregor Robertson from my perspective. But at the same time, you know, the results just aren't there.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is this philosophical difference where I totally agree. I think he's a very smart and impressive person, certainly more than our last prime minister.
That was a very low bar.
But still. But if your natural predisposition to any problem, and maybe it's because you yourself are so competent and have been so competent, is to get more involved and do more things, I just think you run up against this limit of like the government just can't do that many things that well.
Well, and apparently this is why he created these little outside agencies like the Major Projects Office, the Build Canada Homes thing. But there's really no results there either.
The jury's out.
I mean, again, like the big things that they've announced, they're stuff that's been going on for a long time now.
Yeah.
Like the one in Ottawa on Heron Road, for example.
Yeah.
Canada Lands has been into that for 15 years now.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, oh, look what we've done.
Yeah.
You know, it's nuts. So it's a lot of optics and not much results.
One other policy actually from the last election that was never framed specifically as a housing policy, but something that we naturally got excited about in your platform was the capital gains deferral that Pierre was proposing, and it was much broadly framed as like sort of an economic catalyst for the country.
A domestic investment.
Any domestic investment sold, the capital gains can be deferred if the proceeds were then reinvested in another productive asset in Canada.
Yeah.
So and naturally that would have included the housing market, very similar to the U.S. 1031 capital gains exchange. It always felt to me like a guy like Mark Carney might actually see some merits to that kind of idea.
You would think that he would get that.
Has that just completely evaporated from conversation in Ottawa? Like I know Pierre still talks about it
because Pierre gets it. Pierre understands that. Pierre understands that capital can flee faster than anything else, right?
That's right.
And it has been
for decades now.
Yeah.
And so we need to do something like that to make sure that we attract it back, not just keep it here, but attract new investment as well. And I would have thought that Mark Carney would understand that.
But he could sell his blind trust and not pay tax.
I don't know. I mean, maybe. I don't understand.
I tease, but it feels a lot like to me like municipalities latching onto their development charges without realizing that if nobody builds a house, nobody pays you anything. So there's no tax revenue if you stop economic activity. Right?
That's why I say to municipalities: raise it as high as you want. You're not going to collect any more money. But you know the crazy thing about this too, and you guys know this. The municipalities in Ontario collectively are sitting on about $12 billion.
That's right.
Yeah.
They don't know how to spend
development charge reserve money.
Yeah.
$12 billion just sit in the bank.
Yeah.
So I actually said this to Peter Bethlenfauer, the Minister of Finance Ontario, a year ago. I said, Peter, you need to not just permit municipalities, we need to direct municipalities to cash some of that money in and start spending it right now on housing enabling infrastructure because the crisis is now.
Yeah.
It's not 10 years from now. It's now. We need to solve this problem. And there's lots of money to do it.
Yeah. And often the longer they dither, the more construction cost escalation we see. So something that they could have paid for, for a fraction of the cost 5 years ago when they actually had the money in the bank now costs much more and is now used as rationale to increase development charges even further. So it's this vicious cycle.
Actually, I wanted to, on that, I wanted to get your take. Some of this is provincial, but I know often federal money goes into infrastructure as it relates to public transit, whether it's GO trains or subways or whatever. And we're sort of always of two minds on this. We're excited to see that the provincial government is building stuff. There's more GO train infrastructure. There's the Ontario line. There's, these new LRT lines. Say what you will about them. Same thing in other cities around the country. They're always getting built for exorbitant prices. So, obviously it's not directly housing, but it's adjacent, this like housing enabling transit infrastructure that allows us to build. Do you spend a lot of time with that portfolio and your colleague on that issue on, I don't know who this would actually sit with federally, but the funding that ends up going to provinces to build this stuff.
Yeah, it's Dr. Leslie Lewis is our infrastructure critic, and we've certainly spent a bit of time talking about the linkage between, of course, that transportation infrastructure, for example, and housing. But you make an incredibly valid point. It is outrageously more expensive to do a kilometer of subway in Canada than it is anywhere else in North America.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
It's not too dissimilar from the reason it costs so much money to build a house in this country.
Yeah.
Right.
We have made the process so painfully expensive and slow. It's just expensive to do anything in this country because we don't make decisions.
Yeah, I mean, like Alto's a great example. I'd actually love to see a high-speed train connecting the major cities between Ontario and Quebec. I'm just skeptical it'll ever get done or get done at a price that makes any sense.
I'm not a young man anymore, but I don't think that happens in my lifetime.
I don't think it happens in any.
Also, I can commute to work from Montreal to Toronto in theory, But
so maybe we'll end on a note of optimism.
Okay,
if you have any. Well, this is more of a question.
I love your new space. This place looks really nice. This is great. This is a note of optimism.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you coming. Do you like? We're not expecting a federal election anytime soon, but there's probably some work that can be done to kind of move the country in the right direction. Do you see any kind of like bright lights or positive happenings in the near future?
Well, I do. I mean, certainly in our party, as I say, I think it's going to be great for Pierre to get an endorsement at the leadership review. Put that behind us, and then get on with presenting what I think is an incredibly hopeful and positive alternative to Mark Carney and his Liberal government to Canada. I think that there's been some criticisms of Pierre that he's too acerbic or whatever that might be. I think Pierre's done a really good job of recognizing and channeling the energy of young people who feel pretty frustrated, who do feel like the country's broken.
Yeah.
We know that it's not broken, but those institutions that the older generation have used to great benefit are failing the younger generation, and we all need to care about that. I think that Pierre and our team is going to do a great job of demonstrating to all generations why the success of every generation matters to all of us.
Yeah.
I think it's a very hopeful message, and I feel very, very confident that Canadians are going to wake up and go, wait a second, we were sold a bill of goods. This Mark Carney guy sounded like a nice guy, and he is a nice guy, but didn't get the job done. We need the kind of common sense conservative approach that Pierre Poilievre talks about, and he will be the next Prime Minister of Canada, and we'll get this country moving again.
Okay, and we'll be happy to welcome you back when you are housing minister. We'll have more to talk about. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you.
Cool.